Hey everybody, this week for our course on seminal papers in business, we're having a look at this article here, The Rhetoric of Economics by McCloskey. It was published in 1983 in the Journal of Economic Literature, a prestigious journal. It's quite long, so it's going to take a while to get through it. It's over 30 pages long, and it's dense in the sense that it refers to a lot of concepts and a lot of authors who you probably aren't familiar with, but people outside the field of business would be much more familiar with, say, in the areas of philosophy. In that sense, the article has a philosophical bent to it, so to speak. And I think it's been, for that reason, sometimes it's been misinterpreted as a philosophical article. And I think that's not quite right. It's not really about philosophy. It refers to it as a means of making a case for how economists should think about what they're doing, and how they might improve their practices. And this doesn't just apply to economists; it can apply to, accounting and marketing and management and so on as well. In fact, the article by Hines is also kind of part of this same tradition of trying to think about how you would engage in your particular field of study, rather than thinking about it in a narrow, quote-unquote, scientific way or a textbook, cartoonish scientific way, but broaden it out to think about what's really happening here. How do economists, or in the case of the Hines article, how do accountants really engage in their work, and how should they? All right, so this article, 1983 article, was subsequently expanded into a book. This is it here, The Rhetoric of Economics. This is the second edition. The first edition came out in 1985. That's really a straight-up expansion, I think, of the article, with more detail and more fleshed-out case studies or examples. McCloskey then went on to write a couple more books, which are pretty much in the same field. They have the same central themes, that is, the importance of rhetoric to how economists and how scientists engage in their work, and how that's different to what philosophers might say and what economists and others might themselves think about what they're doing. So one of them is a book called Youre So Smart, I think it is, The Narrative of Economic Expertise. I think that came out in 1990. And then there's another book, which I happen to have, which came out in 1994, which is Knowledge and Persuasion in Economics, which is it's obviously a fairly large book. It's over 400 pages long. And this is really it's actually really a collection of articles from all over the place by McCloskey and a couple of one other person in particular. This is more broad-ranging than the other two, I think. All right, so that's that. So McCloskey, what can we say about McCloskey as an author? Well, we can give a kind of a standard story. The standard academic story, I suppose you would say. So McCloskey's born in 1942, so during World War II, on the now infamous date of the 11th of September in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And her father was a professor of government at Harvard, I think, and her mother was a poet. So McCloskey's not coming from an impoverished, struggling background. She's coming from a comfortable, middle-class life in which there is a kind of an academic milieu in existence already. So McCloskey subsequently goes off to Harvard and gets a Bachelor of Arts in Economics in 1964, and then in 1970 completes her doctorate in economic history. I think specializing in the steel industry, in steel and iron industry in Great Britain in the late 19th century, I think it is. After that, well, a bit before she got the PhD, went off to Chicago to teach economics, and she taught the course on price theory. It was a very famous course at Chicago in the Department of Economics. It was previously taken and championed by George Stigler, probably most famously. So taught that for, I think, how long? Would have been about 12 years or so. And then moved to the University of Iowa in 1980, where she became the Professor of Economics and the Professor of History. In 2000, she moved again to the University of Illinois at Chicago and was appointed the Professor of Economics, History, English, and Communications, I think. Yes, I think that's about it. So, what can we say here? We can say that McCloskey obviously starts out as an economist, as a solidly grounded, traditionally trained economist, who is, in particular, an applied economist, so not a pure theoretician, an applied economist, so trying to connect theory to the real world in order to explain real-world phenomena, and in particular, historical phenomena. So, but obviously, we can see by the time we get to 2000 that something's happened. So she's flown the coop, so to speak. That is, she's left the boundary, she's moved beyond the boundaries of the economics discipline into other areas. It doesn't mean that she left economics permanently. That's absolutely not the case. You can clearly see that in her most recent writings. But it's also true that she's expanded her range of interests and range of concerns and sought to integrate them in order to, for example, better understand economic history. That's her latest publications, I think, are evidence of that. I think that this article, this 1983 article, is probably the genesis of that expansion. It's what begins a movement out to other discipline areas and an attempt to understand economics in the light of those other discipline areas, and as an attempt to use those other discipline areas, such as English, such as literature and rhetoric and philosophy, to do economics in a different way, in a more, what we might call, literary way. Okay, so that's that. We should say that McCloskey's major academic contributions are to the fields, and I think this is kind of clear from what I've said already now, are to the areas of economic history, in particular the Industrial Revolution and after, to a field called cliometrics, which is it's related to economic history. So this is the use of econometric techniques to try to describe and explain economic phenomena occurring in history. And then you've got, obviously, the general field of economic methodology. And in particular, her contribution to that being that rhetoric is central to understanding how one conducts oneself as an economist. And remember, it can always be other discipline fields as well. How one conducts oneself as an economist, as opposed to how the kind of official story one might tell about what one is doing. We should think about, what do people actually do? What kinds of arguments do people actually make? How do they actually persuade each other? And another aspect of economic methodology that is of particular importance in McCloskey's case is the use of significance tests in statistical analysis. So McCloskey is, I think we can say, fairly skeptical. That might be putting it mildly. Fairly skeptical of significance tests. Doesn't think that they're particularly valuable. And what's far more important is the sizes of effects. So is an effect very large? Is an effect very small? This is more important in economic terms and in explanatory terms and in policy terms than a success for a statistical test such as the significance test. That's another area of economic methodology which is pushed very hard. Okay, so that's basically, I don't know, McCloskey in a nutshell. Let's have a look at how she describes herself, and then we'll move on. Here's McCloskey's self-description. I'm a literary, quantitative, postmodern, free market, progressive Episcopalian, Midwestern woman from Boston who was once a man. Not conservative. I'm a Christian libertarian. So, well, there's a lot to unpack there, and in fact, too much. I'm not going to bother to try to unpack all of that. The only thing I'll note is, just as a point of clarification, Episcopalian here means, for everyone else in the world, means Church of England or Anglican. So, yes, that's that. All the other terms, I think you can look up for yourself. Probably obviously the most notable thing that kind of stands out there is that McCloskey was once a man. So McCloskey crossed over from being the male Donald to female Deirdre in 1995-97. And if you want to find out more about that, you can read about it in one of her books. I think it's called Crossing. In the other videos, I'm going to use the female personal pronoun for obvious reasons.